especially if you're not going to gain from it, and you gain nothing from it. You're trying to help that person stay alive. So see your interactions with that person as, I'm trying to give you a gift. I'm trying to help you. Now, do you want the help or don't you want the help? Because if you don't, I know there's a whole bunch of people who do want the help. And go and give them help. I can't recommend a brand. It's not like, try Chanel No. 5 or, buy Prada. ARVs don't work that way.
Combined ARVs, are they much better, would you say, or it's just how your body responds to it?
Once again, it's how your body responds. Do you understand how the ARVs work? Let me explain to you very, very quickly here. Actually, not quickly. We got how much time have I got, by the way? There was no set time limit on this.
As long as you need.
Cool. And I've got all day, so there's no rush for me. ARVs. Okay, I'm just trying to think how I'm going to explain this to you. When HIV, let me get a different color. When HIV comes in and it affects a CD4 cell, what happens is there's only specific cells in the body that HIV can infect or be transported by. Number 1 is the CD4 cell. Number 2 is the Langerhans cell. Number 3 is the macrophage. CD4, we've already had a conversation around that. Langerhans is how HIV enters your body. You see, HIV doesn't come into your body invites it in. There are specific cells on the foreskin and in the vagina and also in the anus. And they're called Langerhans cells, also known as dendritic cells. And what they do is, and they have one job and one job only. That is to leave my body, to go into my partner's body, and to look around for any disease or infection that I have not been exposed to, kill it, bring a piece of it back into my body, take it up to my friend the CD4, and show it and go, look, this is this thing that's out there. We need to establish a defense against it should we ever be exposed to it. You following me? So that's the role of the Langerhans. The macrophage is the dustman. All he does is clean up. He's housekeeping. So what happens is HIV is a virus. Now a virus, if I put that virus there, I'll come back in a week and the virus will still be there. It'll be dead, but it'll still be there. If I put a protozoa there and that protozoa is not happy, that protozoa will get up and it'll walk away. So one of the things you need to remember, HIV only goes where you put it. It doesn't go anywhere on its own. So when it sees a macrophage come by, HIV says, oh, look, a free ride. It's like standing there on the side of the road doing this, sees the taxi pull up, which is the macrophage, jumps on, and then rushes to wherever the infection site is. So what the ARVs do, number 1, is they stop the handshake from taking place. Let me use a different color. The first thing that they stop is on a CD4 and on an HIV, you've got these things called receptors. They're like little satellite dishes. And only certain cells, now why are they called like a CD4 or a CD8 or a CD16 is because of the amount of these. It's called cluster differentiation number 4, CD4. You've got CD8, you've got CD16, you've got a whole range of CD cells in your body. So HIV comes along, and like two dogs, you know when two strange dogs see each other, they do that sniff butt thing, and they run around in little circles and go weird. The cells do exactly the same thing until such time as the CD4 cell can find one of these arms or one of these satellite dishes that is similar to the one the CD4 has, at which point it reaches out its hand and it says, "How's it, China?" and they shake hands. As they shake hands, HIV injects its brain into the CD4. HIV is no longer here, it's just its body. Now HIV is inside the cell. It now starts massive replication of babies. It becomes a factory. Once there are enough babies, HIV says to the brain of the CD4 cell, you need to commit suicide. You need to kill yourself. It's called cellular apoptosis, cellular suicide. And quite literally what happens is the skin of the CD4 starts to fall apart. It starts to flake open. And as it flakes open, these little baby HIVs, what they do is they steal some of the fat from the CD4 cell and they hide inside it. So when another CD4 comes along, it looks at it, it goes, "Oh, you look just like me, you can pass." Completely oblivious to the fact that there's this thing called HIV in the body. So the ARVs stop this from taking place. Should that happen and that drug not work, which is why we use combination therapies, what happens next is it stops the virus from taking over the brain or the DNA of that cell. So that's the second part that it blocks. The third part that it blocks is it stops these little babies from getting out and being able to float around in the bloodstream. So it creates a triangle effect. Now the problem with this is your body, or not so much your body, the virus is a very clever virus. So if I forget to take my medication tonight, what's going to happen is one of these walls could potentially break down. At which point the virus, which is essentially trapped inside this cage, can now get out. It gets out, it turns around, it has a look at the cage, it takes out its cell phone, it takes a picture of the cage, and then it changes what it looks like, so when the cage comes back to try and catch it, it doesn't fit anymore. Does that make sense? Which is why we need 3 different types of drugs. One stops the handshake. One stops the transfer of the brain of HIV and hijacking the brain of the cell. The third one stops all the babies from getting out and causing the disaster inside the immune system. Did you know that? Fascinating stuff. So viruses constantly jump species. And what they tend to do is when they jump a species, they sometimes miss a species. So from chicken to pig, no problem at all. From pig to cow, problem, can affect the cow. From cow to monkey, no problem. From monkey to human being, problem. Because as the virus jumps species, it has to change itself so that it can adapt to the new species. So we know the origins of HIV come from the monkey kingdom. Was it some guy screwing a monkey? No, it wasn't, all right? It was a bunch of people almost 100 years ago who were borderline starvation. They were a bunch of slaves who were basically brought in by the Belgian and the German governments to form the Belgian-Congo Railroad line. They walked across Central Africa. This was in 1923. They walked across Central Africa with their army, and they shanghaied at gunpoint all young men and any able-bodied man at gunpoint to come and work on the railroads. They started out in the DRC area, the Democratic Republic of Congo. They worked their way all the way across to Tanzania. The railroad took 7 years to build. There were 27,000 men who were enslaved in this process. No food, no shelter, no medical services. They were just simply slaves. So what happened was, initially the men were able to hunt for stuff around them. They could kill the deers, they could kill the zebra, and any of the animals on the ground. But 27,000 men eating off of the natural resources in a very small and confined area, eventually the food sources are going to run out. So the next thing they did was they started to look up into the trees. And that's where they saw the monkeys. Now remember, these men were very badly treated. They had no access to health care. They were malnourished. They were severely depleted of all their resources. So they were very sick human beings. So a group of them would go hunting. Now, they didn't have daggers or they didn't have guns and all the rest of it. They used to forge pieces of steel that they would steal from the railroad lines, and that's how they killed the animals. So the murdering of the animal was at very close combat, very close quarters. So in the process, because the monkey didn't lie there and go, well, why don't you cut my neck and everything will be fine, you can enjoy me. The monkey would fight like hell. Now, a monkey is about this size, has a strength of 3 men my size. Now, we've got a whole bunch of sick people trying to kill this monkey in close combat. So what's going to happen? There's going to be blood. There's going to be saliva. There's going to be urine. There's going to be all sorts of things going on in the act of trying to kill this monkey. So the virus, SIV, simian immune virus, which is also a retrovirus. Retro is a virus that goes inside the cell and does all its damage, and we know of 5 of them. SIV is one of them. SIV started in the monkeys. It doesn't cause problems in monkeys. They don't die, they don't get sick, they don't get skinny, they don't get the slow puncture like we do as humans. The virus jumped species because the people who were killing the monkeys' immune systems were so severely compromised. Now, how did we find all this out? If you go back in the history of HIV, back in the early 80s when they were trying to identify what is this thing and how do we stop it and how do we get a test for it, their biggest problem was they couldn't keep HIV alive long enough to find out what made it all work. So there was some dude that said, well, hang on a second. if we can compromise an immune system in a petri dish, what will be the effects? They took healthy CD4s and they threw HIV in and nothing happened. The minute they used cortisone or cortisol to weaken that blood sample or weaken the immune system in that sample, they weakened it to a point where the CD4 count was almost non-existent. They introduced HIV, instant infection. So we now know the transmission and how that took place. The actual process of who infected who and which monkey and how that all happened, that is a hypothesis, but it's based on what actually happened at that point in time. Now move forwards, it was about six and a half years, so from 23 to about 1929. The railroad was now finished. The Belgian government said to the remaining 5,000 men, so 22,000 men died in the production of this railroad line, said to the remaining 5,000 men, we're done with you, you can footsec now. Go back to your countries. They started moving back across Africa. They would go to Kenya, they would go to Tanzania, and suddenly we started to see about 5 or 6 years later this new disease called Slim's disease. But because it was happening in Africa, who cares? It's Africans. We don't care about Africans. It's not happening in America or London. Screw the Africans. So as early as 1935, there were reports of villages where people were getting this disease, they were getting incredibly skinny, and they were dropping like flies. So HIV has been around for almost 100 years. This is not a new disease at all. It's actually quite an old disease. But it's only because a bunch of pissed off gay men in America started to get infected that the world started to go, oh, big gedunta, and now we're suddenly paying attention to Africa. And you know, one of the weirdest things, and I am a returned exile, but one of the weirdest things about the apartheid system is it protected our country from HIV. As bizarre as it sounds, it was the only positive thing that ever came out of the apartheid system, was the fact that our borders were closed, so people were not migrating backwards and forwards. In 1994, our HIV infection rate was less than 1%. 1994, when the rest of the world was sitting at 7 and 8 and 9%, we were only sitting at 1%. So imagine if HIV had entered into our country into the early 80s or into the late 70s. It would have devastated us. We would not be in the position we are in today. We would be a real third world country. So in a strange, bizarre way, and as reluctant as I am to admit it, apartheid saved our country and acted as a buffer for about 15 years. It gave us enough lead time so we can now introduce antiretrovirals and save people's lives. So one of the useless bits of information. Come, more questions. Overwhelm. And there's lots more. Yes, ma'am.
What I need to know is that what happens if a person is on ARVs and then he suddenly stops and he stops taking them? Because I had a person who said, no, I stopped without the doctors.
Oof. You see, that's the problem. I've just come off of a drug holiday myself. I took a 2-month break from the medication, but it was supervised. And the reason for that was I was starting to develop these weird skin infections, which are unrelated to HIV, but they thought it could be my antiretrovirals that were causing the problem. Subsequently, that isn't the case. It's called an STI, a structured treatment interruption, not a sexually transmitted infection, all right? All these acronyms we have to remember. A person can come off and go on antiretrovirals, but it should only be done under medical supervision. I get very nervous when people say to me, oh, I've decided not to take my pills, because that to me is an indication that they don't have a desire to live. And it all comes back to motivation. And one of the key things we have to do in order to keep this business model sustainable is keep people like me alive. Without me, you don't have a job. Without me, you don't have a business. All right? So it's now a matter of your very business is at stake. So you've got to have these conversations with people. You need to keep me alive, keep me on my antiretroviral, so I keep making my payment, so you still keep getting your salary. And that's the way we need to think about this. I know it sounds cold and harsh, but that's the reality. Does it answer your question?
How long were you out of?
Only for 2 months. I am very reluctant. I mean, I know from your company's protocol perspective, the minute that person goes off, they're in violation of the entire process. I mean, they signed an agreement with you that they would notify you at a moment's notice that I've gone off medication, or I'm changing my protocol, or I'm refusing. I mean, you guys know about the compliance and adherence issues and how strict everyone is around that. And there's a reason for it. It protects your business and it keeps your client base alive. It's not a bad thing. So now, one here and then I'll come to you.
Like I had a client, a CD4 count is 900, she was on ARVs.
She doesn't need to be at 900.
Yeah, but she just That's what she told me and stuff. She was adamant that she's living a healthy lifestyle. But with regards to the adherence support, I had to convince her that she need to go for a CD4 count and a body load every 6 months. I explained to her this, what it does and whatever. But she was like quite adamant that, I'm living healthy. I see my medical doctor. I don't need on to be an adherence support. So how do I stress that to her, the importance of that 6 months CD4 count and body load?
Isn't that part of the protocol that she signed up for?
Yeah, but how do I stress the importance, from my side, how do I stress the importance of, how do I sell it?
Well, the only way would be to say that's the only way we can monitor what's going on. You can't go by how you're feeling. I know people who are walking around with 7 CD4s, and they've had 7 CD4s for the last 10 years, and they're as healthy as an ox. I know people who had CD4 counts of 400, and they died. All right, so we can't use that as an indicator. What we must stress to the people is the viral load is the key. Now, you can't look at a CD4 count and know how high the viral load is. The CD4 count could be 600, and the viral load could be sitting at 10 million. And they're just this little HIV transmission machine. So it's a matter of educating your clients about it and stressing to her the importance. And also, she signed an agreement. When she took out your insurance.
Like once a year, it's fine. I don't need to go every on a 6 months basis.
But isn't that what the protocol is? You guys have a standard protocol. I get a reminder every 6 months, go for your bloods. Your bloods are due. So if she doesn't want to comply, then kick her off the program. You're at risk of losing the only insurance you're probably ever going to get as an HIV positive person. Do you really want to jeopardize this? Because our protocol calls for this, and you agreed to it. So you're now in violation of the protocol. So how are we going to fix this? Well, the only way I know to fix it is to go get a CD4 count, and please fax me the details. Do you want to go on Monday or Tuesday, and can I help you make the appointment? Create the illusion of choice. It's called a double bind. Did you see what I did there? Come, there was a question in the back there.
Almost answered my question. Because I wanted to know, basically, as a client, what experience can you share with someone who is a prospective client to AllLife that you have received from the service of taking a life cover?
Well, you guys saved my ass, whether you know it or not. I mean, you guys are always about the insurance, and you get the letters from the people who benefited from the person who died, right? Oh, if it wasn't for AllLife, my mother died, and they left me the money, and now the kids are going to school, and blah, blah, blah. There's a whole other side to this you guys have never even thought about. Because of you, I was able to get a bond to buy a home. If it wasn't for AllLife, I couldn't have got the insurance to cover the bond to help me buy my home. All right? So you put me into a house. If it wasn't for you, I'd still be renting something. Now, most of your clients don't even think in that regard, but it's a great selling point. If you want to get life insurance, it's going to enable you in 6 months' time to go put a deposit down on a house. Why? Because you've now got that leverage. You're planning on being alive. You're taking your antiretrovirals. You're going to be alive for the next 25 years. Hell, why not invest in a house? Makes sense. There's another selling point. It's a unique selling point. And you are the only people in the industry other than group coverage that will give us that kind of comprehensive cover. You're expensive, but you're good. That's the reality. That's the reality. I mean, and Ross wasn't even aware of this when I said to him, because he was going off about, oh, how we're changing people's lives and all the goodwill. And it's like, oh, shut up. What's actually happening is you guys are allowing people like me to have a life, which I didn't have before. I couldn't own property. Now I can. Now I own a whole bunch of property thanks to you. Become a slumlord. Does that answer your question? Right. So once again, sell it to the clients.
There are studies around the virus, right?
Yeah.
But
just a few.
What's the progress or the possibility of cure?
Let me ask you a question. As a business person, would it make more sense for you to keep me alive and keep me on chronic medication for as long as possible to maximize my spend value with you? Or would it make more sense for you to come up with a once-off that you're going to charge me 10,000 Rand for, and then that's it, we're done, AIDS is over? Absolutely. So HIV has become an industry, and I mean this in the most callous, jaded way that I can possibly think of. I call it AIDS Inc. Right? It's become an industry, and I'm part of the industry, you're part of the industry. It's huge. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry. It makes no sense to come up with a cure. There's too many people who've got pension funds and provident funds and career paths attached to HIV. So it makes no sense to find a cure. Let's keep the people alive as long as we can. The drug companies make money. The insurance companies make money. Everybody's making money. It's a new economy. There's nothing wrong with it. I don't have a judgment about it. It's a new economy. And it's a good economy because it's going to be around for a long time. Right? HIV is going nowhere. The average pandemic, and HIV is a standard pandemic, lasts 200 years. 200 years. Think about it. The Great Plague of Europe from 1300 to 1500 AD, 200 years. The bubonic plague from 500 to 700, 200 years. The only pandemic we've had that didn't last that long was the pandemic of the swine flu of 1918, which wiped out 40 million people in 18 months. Right? HIV is being compared to that, but now HIV has been around so long, and all we've ever looked at is the numbers since the Americans started complaining about HIV. What about all the Tanzanians who died, the Kenyans, and all those people across East Africa, the millions and millions and millions of people who died from 1929 to 1983 when we first started screaming and shouting about HIV? So we've still got another 100 years of HIV. It's going to be here for your grandchildren's grandchildren to deal with. Okay? Sad truth, but a truth.
So in the light of that, how do we educate our kids? What focus do we put on sex education
Truth.
and HIV?
Truth. What we tend to do is we tend to pass along our own sexual dysfunction to our children. Think about what I just said. Most of us have got pretty screwed up ideas about sex. Why? Because our parents never sat down and said to us, this is your penis, this is a vagina, this is what goes where, go north, go south. There was none of those conversations that took place. So I don't know about you, but I learned about sex at the tuck shop at Westfield Boys High School in 1974. Right, that's where I learned about sex. So I got some other screwed up kid giving me his screwed up notion of what sex was. You know, in those days we had National Geographic and girls' titties and ooh, you know, big excitement. It's a very different world that you're growing up in today. If you're raising children in today's society, you have a moral obligation to educate your children from the time they are as young as possible about their sexual bodies, not about sex, about their sexual body. If I asked most women in this room, why do you have a period, and explain to me the mechanisms and how it all happens, I guarantee you 50% of you will not be able to answer that question. And yet it's something that happens to your body every single month. You go through it, and you will go through it for the next 35 years, and yet you are clueless as to why it's going on. We need to educate people. And we start as young as we possibly can. And we don't give it silly names like your toti and your fuzi. No. And I don't want to hear this nonsense of, in my culture, we don't talk about sex, because it's bloody rubbish. All right? If I asked you right now to give me all the names that you have for a penis, I would fill up 3 sheets. Give me all the names for a vagina. Ooh, there'd be all these names. Give me the names for the act of sex, intercourse. There'd be all these names. So I'd have 50 names for a penis, 50 names for a vagina, and 100 names for the act of sex. And you're trying to tell me you don't talk about sex? You've got all these names for something you don't talk about? It's nonsense. We need to start talking. If you look at cultures that have an open and honest dialogue around sex and sexuality and human sexuality, they don't have anywhere near the rape. They don't have anywhere near the domestic violence. They don't have anywhere near the HIV or STIs that we deal with in our repressive society. Because what happens is in the workplace, it's all about equal rights. Yeah, we're all equal. Ladies are equal. Men are equal, blah, 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 blah. The minute we go behind our closed doors, the old roles come back out again. I'm the woman. I'm subservient. I turn the light off. I don't get involved. I don't challenge. I don't question. And yet, in the work environment, you're screaming and shouting about your rights. You need to transport that into your personal worlds. And how do I know the effect that this is going to have? Look at what you are teaching your children. How do they see you being treated by a man? How do they see you as a man treating a woman? What are you teaching your kids? Oh, it's okay to slap a woman. Oh, okay, cool. Walk up and give her a clap in the kitchen because she didn't make my pup right. Right? That is the message we're sending to our children. So remember, the apple never falls too far from the tree. So if you have a really screwed up notion about sex, about sexuality, the roles and the responsibility of men and women, you are simply going to transfer that nonsense onto your children, and you are contributing to the dysfunction of our society. So we, as the adults, we can't wait for the next generation. Your parents your grandparents waited for your parents. Your parents waited for you. Now you're waiting for your children. We're all waiting for the next generation to do something about this. Where does it stop? Where do we stand up and say, as uncomfortable as this is, this conversation needs to happen? Why? Because it's a whole lot more uncomfortable standing at your child's grave going, I wish I had had a conversation. I wish I'd had the courage to speak to my child openly. We are sexual human beings. Deal with it. Sex is good. It's fun. It's nice. Lekker. Even for an old fart like me. Yes?
At what age can you start talking about sex to somebody?
I think if you introduce their sexual body to them from the time they're capable of talking, by the time you get to talking about sex, now if I look at rural communities, and I don't know what it's like in the space where you live and how you hang out, but I work largely in rural communities. We've got the small building that these people live in, basically a shack. There's mom and dad, and there's 5 or 6 kids, and they are literally having sex at 6 inches from their children, but they won't talk about it. So the kids know all these weird things are going on. There's grunting and noises and sounds happening and strange smells and all sorts of weird things going on, but we're not talking to the kid and saying, listen, this is what mommy and daddy do. This is what adults do. And when you get old enough, you too will be able to do that as well. If you have a healthy approach towards it, it's like a child. When a child hurts themselves, if you overreact, the child overreacts. If you don't overreact, chances are the child won't overreact either. I go back to the example of the countries where they talk about sex, where education is introduced at the youngest age. They start talking about sex at age 5, not the act of sex. Don't confuse sexual act with sexual understanding. It's about your sexual body versus the sexual act. In those countries where they've had those conversations, they have way less rape, way less domestic violence, way less HIV. Everything supports the fact that in an open, honest society where there are those kind of communication and courageous conversations take place with the children, we don't have the problems we have here. Because why? We've steeped sex in this horrible thing, shouldn't be talked about. We all do it. We put the lights off, we jigger, 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 and we pretend like it hasn't happened. Isn't that true? Yes or no?